Her name was Sarah. Not that anyone used it. In the palace, Omegas did not have names. They had numbers stitched into the left collar of their uniforms, black thread on gray cloth, and if someone needed you, they called the number. If no one needed you, they called nothing. You moved through the halls like a shadow moves. Present, necessary, invisible. Sarah was number 41. She had been 41 for 7 years. The assignment came the way all bad things came in her life. Quietly, from the side, while she was busy doing something else. She was in the supply room at the end of the east corridor, counting mop heads because someone had to count the mop heads, and that someone was always her, when the head housekeeper opened the door and said, without looking up from her clipboard, 41, throne room, tonight, before dawn. Sarah stopped counting. The whole room, she asked. The whole room. That's 4 hours of work. Then you'd better start early. The housekeeper made a mark on her clipboard. Everything. Floors, windows, the stone columns, the base of the throne, the steps. Everything polished. Everything clean. Done before first light or… She paused. She always paused here, because the pause was the point. Or you don't come back. She left. Sarah stood in the supply room and looked at the mop heads for another moment. Then she picked up her bucket. The handle had a crack in it, right at the joint where it connected to the bucket. A thin break that meant if you held it wrong it pinched the skin between your thumb and forefinger hard enough to leave a mark. She had been requesting a new bucket for 3 months. She had stopped expecting one. She held it at the angle that didn't hurt and walked toward the throne room. This is what 7 years did to a person. It didn't make you bitter. Not exactly. It made you practical. You stopped hoping for a new bucket, and you learned the angle. The throne room was at the center of the palace, which meant it was equidistant from everything and convenient to nothing. Getting there from the east supply corridor meant walking through the long gallery, past the portrait hall, down the stone staircase that was always cold because of the way the wind came through the high narrow windows, and then through 2 sets of heavy doors that she was not, technically, supposed to open herself. She opened them anyway. The room was dark when she entered, dark the way old places go dark, not just without light but heavy with the absence of it, like the dark had been sitting there long enough to develop opinions. The ceiling was so high she couldn't see it. She knew from daylight visits that there were carvings up there, old wolves and older symbols, but at this hour the ceiling was just a rumor. She set her bucket down. She pulled out her cloth. She went to work. This was the thing about Sarah that no one knew, because no one watched Omegas long enough to know anything about them. She was good at this. Not just adequate, actually good. She had a method. She started at the far left wall and worked right, top to bottom, section by section, so that she never cleaned something twice and never missed anything. She noticed things. The way a stone was crumbling at a corner, the mineral stain on the window ledge that had been there long enough to calcify, the smear of something dark on the lower left column that she was going to need the other cloth for. She worked in silence. She worked in the dark, using the thin moonlight from the high windows, moving around the room like water finding the low places. She had been working for maybe 20 minutes when she realized the throne was occupied. She noticed because she moved closer to it than she usually did in her first pass. Normally she left the throne itself for last, doing the perimeter first, and tonight she would have done the same except that her method brought her around the left side of the room at an angle that put her closer to the dais than she expected, and so she was perhaps 6 feet away when she saw, in the dark, in the not quite dark, that the throne was not empty. Someone was sitting in it. She stopped. She did not drop anything. She did not gasp. 7 years in this palace had burned those reflexes out of her early. She just stopped, cloth in one hand, bucket in the other, and processed what she was looking at. A man, sitting in the throne, in the dark, at 2 in the morning, doing nothing, not reading, not reviewing documents, not speaking to anyone, because there was no one to speak to, just sitting. The way a stone sits in a river, present, still, going nowhere, with the water rushing around it and not moving it at all. She knew who he was. Of course she did. You could not live in this palace for 7 years and not know the face of the Alpha King. You just never expected to see it like this, slack and unguarded in the dark, the face of absolute power with all the power switched off. His name was Kale. He was the seventh king of his line, the youngest in 300 years to take the throne. The one who had ended the northern border wars in 2 years, when every advisor told him it would take 10. He was the reason the palace had food stores that could last 3 winters. He was also the reason 16 Omega workers had been reassigned to the outer compounds last year for unspecified violations, which in practice meant they had been gotten rid of, and no one talked about it. She knew all of this. She also knew that he had not moved or indicated awareness of her presence. So she kept working. This was, she understood, either the smartest thing she had ever done or the stupidest. There was no middle ground when it came to being an uninvited Omega in the personal space of the Alpha King. But the math was simple. She had been told to clean the room. She was cleaning the room. If she stopped, she was failing at the one job she had been given. If she kept going, she was just doing her work. She kept going. She moved to the left column. She worked the stone with her cloth. She kept her head down, her movement steady, and she did not look at him. He watched her the way you watch something that doesn't fit in the category you've assigned it to. Curious, slightly thrown, not yet decided what to do with the information. Your name. His voice was low, not unkind, not kind either, just a voice that had spent its whole life saying things that happened afterward. Sarah looked up from the column. 41, she said. That's a number. It's my designation, sir. I asked for your name. A pause. She considered. There was no protocol for this. There was no section of the Omega Handbook that covered what to do when the king asked you your name at 2 in the morning while you were trying to clean around him. Sarah, she said. He looked at her, just looked, not assessing, not cataloging, not the way alphas usually looked at omegas, which was the same way people looked at furniture. Present, functional, ignorable. He looked at her the way you look at a sentence that doesn't parse the way you expected. How long have you served in this palace, Sarah? 7 years. And how many times have you cleaned this room? She thought about it. 11, maybe 12. I don't have seniority in the rotation. I get it when others don't want it. Why don't they want it? She looked at him. She should have said something careful. She said what was true. It's in the center of the palace, so it's a long walk. The columns are carved, which means they take 3 times as long to clean properly. And she stopped. And no one likes to be in here after dark. Why not? The room has a feeling. He was quiet for a moment. What kind of feeling? Sarah looked up at the ceiling she couldn't see. Like something old is watching. She paused. Sorry. That was... Don't apologize for it, he said. You're right. She turned back to the column. He stayed in the throne. The silence after that was a different kind than before. Not empty, but inhabited. Something was living in it now. She wasn't sure what to call it, so she didn't call it anything. She cleaned the column. She moved to the next one. He kept asking questions. This surprised her. In her experience, which was, granted, the experience of someone who was supposed to be invisible, powerful people did not ask questions. They issued. They decided. They occasionally barked. Questions were a form of investment, and powerful people invested only in things that would pay them back, and Omegas were not considered a good return. But he asked, what did she eat for breakfast? Whether she had a preference, whether she'd ever been to the north wing of the palace, the part that opened onto the high garden. She answered, simply, without decoration. 7 years in this place had stripped the decoration out of her speech, the way repeated washing strips color from cloth. She had started with normal sentences and ended up with just the essential ones. She'd had bread this morning. No preference, she ate what was available. No, she'd never been to the high garden. Omegas weren't permitted in the north wing above the 3rd floor. He went quiet at that last one. Not the quiet of a man who didn't know. The quiet of a man who did know and was deciding what to do with knowing. She finished the 3rd column and moved to the 4th. What do you think about, he said, when you're doing this? She glanced at him. I'm sorry? While you work, what goes through your head? No one had ever asked her this. She was so unprepared for it that she answered honestly before she could construct a better response. "Tonight, I've been thinking about the grout." He blinked. "The grout. Between the floor stones. See the lines there?" She pointed with her cloth, a gesture that was probably not appropriate for addressing a king, but she was already in it. "These stones are very old, pre-palace old, which means they were moved here from somewhere else. But the grout between them is newer. Different material, different color if you look at the right angle in the right light. Whoever regrouted these floors did it maybe 100 years ago, which means these stones have been reset at least once since the palace was built." She paused. "I've been wondering what the original floor looked like, whether the stones were closer together, whether the gaps were always this wide." He stared at her. She went back to the column. "No one," he said slowly, "has ever told me that before." "About the grout?" "About anything like that. About the palace itself, the history and the details. Most people aren't paid to look at the details closely. And you are?" "I'm paid to clean them," she said. "Looking is just something I do while I'm at it." He left the throne eventually. She was startled when he moved. She had half convinced herself he was going to sit there all night like a very large and complicated piece of furniture. But he stood, stretched in a way that was privately, entirely human, the stretch of a man whose back hurt, and walked off the dais. Not toward the doors, toward the windows. He stood at the tall window and looked out at the dark grounds below. She cleaned. "Do you ever wish you could leave?" he asked. She considered the question properly. "Leave the palace," she said, "or leave in general?" "Either. I think about the outside," she said. "I haven't been outside the walls since I arrived. I'm not complaining. It's the terms of service." She paused. "But I think about it. What the city sounds like, whether it smells different from in here. The palace smells like stone and old cloth and the thing they use to polish the banisters." Another pause. "Outside probably smells like—" She searched for it. "Normal things. Bread, rain, dirt." He turned from the window. "That's a very specific longing. Specific is all I've got." She rinsed her cloth. "If I spent my time on the general version of missing things, I'd never stop." He looked at her. That same look again, the one that didn't have a name yet. She moved on to the windows. She found the throne crack at the third hour. She had been saving the throne itself for last, as she always did, working her way inward from the room's perimeter, so that by the time she reached the centerpiece, everything else was done, and she could give it proper attention. The throne was a demanding piece of architecture. Tall-backed carved stone, wolves running along the arms in relief, a base that was more of a platform with its own steps, the whole thing ancient and heavy and slightly terrifying even with no one in it. She started at the base. She worked up the left side, cloth moving over the carved stone, collecting the fine dust that gathered in the relief lines of the wolves. She was working the left rear pillar of the base when her cloth caught on something. She stopped. She looked. A crack, hairline thin, running diagonally down the rear pillar, starting about halfway up and running to the base. Old, ancient really, the edges of it smoothed and worn rather than sharp, and filled, packed with decades of whatever polish the palace used, layered on so many times and so carefully that if you weren't looking for it, if you weren't running your cloth at exactly the right angle, you would miss it completely. It had been hidden, not accidentally, deliberately. She ran her thumb along it. "There's a crack," she said. He was back in the throne. She'd heard him return while she was working the windows, and he looked down at her from above. "In the base," she said. "Left rear pillar. It's old." "I know," he said. She looked up at him. "You know?" "Yes." "How long have you known?" He took a moment to answer. "Since shortly after my coronation. One of the staff pointed it out, quietly, in private, and it was never fixed." "No. Why not?" He was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that costs something, that you can hear the cost of, because no one wanted to be the person who told me my throne was broken. Sarah sat back on her heels and looked at the crack. She thought about all the polish layered into it, year after year. Someone with a cloth and a tin of polish, pressing it into the crack, smoothing it over, making the surface look perfect from 5 feet away. The diligence it had taken to keep this secret, the deliberate, careful work of hiding a broken thing instead of fixing it. She thought about the king in that throne, year after year. Sitting on the brake, she did not say any of this. She said, "I'll need a different tool to clean this properly. The cloth won't reach into the crack itself." "Use what you have," he said. "It doesn't need to be perfect." She looked up at him again. "Everything in this room is imperfect," she said, "and has been for a long time. One more thing doesn't add to the total." She paused. "But the crack should be fixed." "I know. Someone should fix it." "I know that too." He looked straight ahead, not at her. Knowing something needs to be fixed and having the people around you willing to say it out loud are different problems. She looked at the crack again. She did not ask any more questions. She worked the tool she had, the edge of her cloth, folded to a point, working into the crack, clearing out as much of the packed old polish as she could. It was careful work. It took time. He sat above her and didn't speak for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It had the texture of two people in a room together who have stopped performing at each other and are just existing. This was, she would think later, the moment. Not the crack, not the conversation. The silence after it, when she was working on his broken throne and he was letting her, and neither of them was pretending the situation was something it wasn't. Dawn was still an hour away when she finished everything. She stood in the center of the room and looked around at it. The floor caught what little moonlight there was and held it. The columns were clean, the carved lines of them sharp and true. The windows were clear, no smear, no haze, just the black turning blue of the sky, beginning to reconsider its position on the whole darkness question. The steps of the dais were done. The throne itself was done. The great carved wolves of the armrests cleaned out and clear. The crack in the rear pillar as clean as she could make it without the proper tools, which she had noted in the internal report she would file in her head and probably never in writing. It was a good room. Underneath all the weight of what it was used for, it was a genuinely beautiful old room. She thought about the people who had built it, whether they had been proud of it. She picked up her bucket. She gathered her cloths. She turned toward the door. Sarah. She stopped. Her name, not her number. Her name. She turned around. He was still in the throne. He had moved back into it sometime in the third hour, and she had stopped noticing him, the way you stop noticing a sound that's been there long enough. Not because it stops being present, but because your brain files it under constant and moves on. She had filed the king of everything under constant and moved on with her work. He was looking at her now. Not the way he'd looked at her in the beginning, which had been the look of a man encountering an unexpected variable. Now he looked at her the way you look at something you've been thinking about long enough that it has acquired the feeling of being important, without you being fully certain why. She waited. "How long until you need to be back?" he said. She considered. "First bell is in about an hour. I have to return the supplies by then. And after first bell? I have my regular assignments, third floor east corridor and the guest receiving rooms on the second. All day? Until evening bell." He was quiet for a moment. She could not read his face, which was unusual for her. She had spent 7 years reading the faces of people who had power over her, learning the tells and the moods the way a weather reader learns clouds. Survival skill, not interest. His face was not giving her anything she knew what to do with. "What do you do in the evenings?" he asked. She stopped. It was such a strange question. No one asked Omegas about their evenings. I read, if I'm not too tired, the palace library allows Omega workers on the lower floors during the last bell. I go when I can. What do you read? History, mostly. Architecture. I've been reading about pre-palace construction methods. There's a book about the original stonework. She paused. That's why I knew about the floor grout. He looked at her for another long moment. "Sit down," he said. She blinked. "Sir, you've been on your feet for hours. Sit down." There was, nearby, a very old bench along the wall. A visitor bench, the kind nobles sat on when they waited to be received. She looked at it. "That's," she was going to say, "not for me," or "not appropriate," or any of the dozen other phrases that lived in her mouth, from 7 years of knowing exactly where she was permitted and where she wasn't. She stopped. All right. She sat on the visitor bench. Her back thanked her immediately and without reservation. She set the bucket down at her feet. She put her cloths on top of the bucket. She sat with her spine straight, because that was how she always sat, not out of formality, but because the low cot in her room had given her the kind of back that only worked if it was kept in line. He looked at her sitting on the bench. "Better?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He nodded. He looked away, out at the room she had just cleaned. She watched his face as he looked at the floors and the columns and the windows and the throne, and she saw something happen in his expression that she couldn't quite name but recognized anyway. It was the face of someone seeing a thing clearly for the first time in a while. The face of someone who had stopped being able to see it because they were inside it all the time, and then something shifted, and they saw it again. "It's a good room," she said. He looked at her. "When it's clean," she added. "It's always been a good room," he said. "I forget that. People forget what they live in." "What do you mean?" She thought about how to say it. "When I first came to the palace, I used to stop sometimes in the corridors. Just stop and look at the stonework, the arches, the way the light came through the high windows in the afternoon. 7 years later, I walk the same corridors and I don't see any of it. I'm thinking about the supply list, or which rooms need the deep clean, or whether there'll be anything left in the kitchen by the time my rotation ends." She looked around the room. "I think it happens to everyone. You stop seeing the room and start seeing the logistics of the room." He was quiet. "I see this room," he said finally, "as a place where things are decided, consequences. I've stopped seeing it as—" he gestured vaguely at the carved ceiling he couldn't see either, "as a place someone built. Who cared about the grout? Someone did." Yes. They sat with that for a moment. The sky outside the high windows was doing its very gradual version of changing its mind. Not light yet, just slightly less dark. She should have gone. She was very aware of this fact the whole time she was not going. Every minute she sat on the visitor bench was a minute past the reasonable end of this situation. She had finished the work. She had her supplies. The door was right there. The appropriate thing, the safe thing, the thing that 7 years in this palace had trained into her as thoroughly as breathing, was to stand up, say her dismissal phrase, and leave. She stayed. She wasn't sure why, exactly. She was aware of the danger of staying. She was aware of the logistics of the morning, and first bell, and the east corridor that needed cleaning, and the way the housekeeper looked at her when she was late. She was aware of all of it. She stayed because the room was very quiet, and the bench was solid, and the man in the throne across the room was not looking at her the way anyone had looked at her in 7 years, and she would not use the word moved, she refused to use the word moved, she was aware of it. She stayed. He asked her more questions, small ones. Not the big political machinery of a king interrogating someone. Smaller than that, the kind of questions that people ask when they are actually curious. What was the worst room in the palace to clean, in her opinion? She said the portrait hall, because the frames were gilded, and gilt collected everything. What was the best? She said the old kitchen, because no one was ever in it, and it had a smell she liked. Old stone and herbs that had been drying there for so long the smell was structural. He laughed at that. She was so startled she almost dropped the cloth she was still holding. The Alpha King had a laugh. Not a polished, controlled, diplomatic sound. A real one. It came out like it surprised him too, which it seemed to. He pressed his lips together right after, the way people do when they've accidentally shown something they're not sure was meant for the room. "Sorry," he said. "Don't apologize for it," she said, and then realized she was repeating his own words back at him. He noticed. A corner of his mouth moved. She was thinking about leaving again, actually building toward it, when she shifted on the bench and the bucket at her feet tipped, and the cloths inside slid out onto the floor. She bent to pick them up. When she straightened, he was on the floor, not fallen. He had, apparently, walked down from the dais at some point without her noticing, which was another version of the thing that kept happening tonight, the way her usual sharpness with him kept softening into ordinary presence, the way she kept forgetting to maintain the correct amount of attention to where he was and what he was doing. He was 4 feet from her, crouched to pick up the cloth nearest his foot. He held it out. She took it. Their hands did not touch. Barely missed. She sat back on the bench and held the cloth. He sat, not on the bench, on the floor, back against the wall beside it, long legs out in front of him, which was so far outside any image of an Alpha King that she had to run through it twice to make it real. He sat on the floor like a person sits on the floor. Like a man who is tired of being at height. "Are you comfortable?" she asked, before she thought about whether to ask it. "No," he said. "The floor is cold. The bench has room." He looked up at the bench. He looked at her on the bench. Something in his face was doing a very careful calculation. He sat on the other end of the bench. She moved over fractionally to give him room she didn't actually need to give. He settled. The bench was long. There was a respectable distance between them. And yet the room, which had been big and hollow and old, suddenly felt smaller. Not smaller in a bad way, in the way a room feels smaller when it has the right number of people in it. She looked at her cloth. She looked at the crack in the throne's base from this distance. "It really should be fixed," she said. "I know. Not just the crack. The other thing." She kept her eyes on the throne. The reason it wasn't fixed. The reason everyone polished over it and said nothing. She paused. "That's the part that should be fixed." He was very still beside her. "The people around you," she said carefully, because she was walking into a territory she had no map for, and she knew it. "The ones who knew about the crack and kept polishing instead of telling you. That's She stopped. "I don't have the right word for what that is." "A failure," he said. His voice was quiet and exact. "A particular kind," she said. "Failure dressed up as loyalty." He didn't say anything. She probably should not have said any of that. She ran a quiet internal inventory of how badly she had just stepped over lines she was not permitted to step over. The tally was considerable. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, "How do you know things like this?" "What things?" "The grout. The polished-over failures. The particular kinds of dishonesty that live inside service." She thought about it. "I've been close to the ground for a long time," she said. "Literally. I spend a lot of time at floor level. You see things differently from down here." A pause. "What do you see?" "What no one considers worth hiding," she said, "because they don't think anyone important is watching." The sky went from dark to gray. This was not sunrise. This was the step before sunrise, the sky's way of warming up, of saying something is coming without committing to what. The high windows of the throne room received this new gray light and passed it along to the floor, and the floor, which Sarah had just cleaned, accepted it and held it. She could see the room now, properly. Everything she'd done in the dark by moonlight and memory was visible in the growing gray, the columns standing clean and clear, the floor running deep and even, the throne sitting solid and complicated, and still cracked in the back, where no one had ever looked closely enough. She stood. She picked up the bucket. She picked up the cloths, all of them this time, properly stowed. "I need to go soon," she said. He stood too. He was taller than she had accounted for. The throne's dais added height, and all night she had either been looking up at him or looking at the room, and now they were standing at the same level, and it recalibrated something she hadn't realized needed recalibrating. She looked at the door. She looked back at him, because it was polite, because it was human, because 7 years of invisibility had not killed the basic human impulse to acknowledge the person you had spent a night with in a room. He was looking at her with the look she still didn't have a name for. "Stay," he said. Just the one word. Not commanding, not royal, not the voice that ended wars and sorted people into their designated stations. The other voice. The one she'd heard when he laughed, when he said the floor was cold, when he told her no one had ever mentioned the crack. "Stay." She stood in the doorway of a room she had been sent to clean. She stood with a cracked bucket in her hand and a morning's worth of tiredness in her back. She thought about the east corridor, the housekeeper, the number stitched into her collar. She set the bucket down. She did not go back to the bench. She went to the base of the dais and sat on the first step, spine straight, hands on her knees, facing the room she had cleaned. The way she actually sat when she had somewhere to sit, and no one was grading her on it. He did not say anything about the step. He went back to the throne, and they sat together in the growing light, him in the throne and her on the step below it, and they did not speak, and this was the version of speaking that happened when all the words had already been said. The first servants came at first bell. Sarah heard the distant sound of the bell, and then, very shortly after, the sound of feet in the corridor, the particular shuffle and hurry of morning staff beginning rounds. She tracked it the way she had always tracked sounds in this palace, automatically, the background program that always ran. 2 sets of feet. They stopped outside the throne room doors. A pause, the pause of someone who sees light under a door and is not sure it should be there. Then the door opened. 2 junior servants. Young. She recognized one of them, a second-year girl from the linen rotation, who went by the name Mira, and who had never once met Sarah's eyes in a corridor. Both of them stood in the doorway and processed what they were looking at. The cleaned room, the growing light, the Alpha King in his throne, and the Omega sitting on the step below it. They stood very still. Sarah watched their faces do the math. She knew what the math produced. She had been doing the same math since before it happened, running the scenarios, understanding the architecture of what this looked like and what it meant, and what happened next. What happened next was, these 2 servants told someone. That person told someone. That chain moved quickly in a palace because there was nothing to slow it, no firewall between what people saw and what people said. She stood. The bucket was where she had set it down. She picked it up. She picked up her cloths. She looked at the door, at the 2 servants still standing in it, watching her with the specific, terrible fascination of people witnessing something they are not sure is their responsibility. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. She kept her face still. She had always been good at this. The particular composure of a person who has learned that visible feeling is a vulnerability and so has made a practice of keeping the feeling somewhere the walls cannot see it. She was very good at still. He watched her pick up the bucket. He watched her hold it at the careful angle, the angle she had taught herself to manage the crack in the handle. He watched her take a step toward the door. Sarah, her name again, but this time it was not quiet, the way it had been before, the private sound of a man in an empty room reaching for something to call a thing. This time it was not for her. It landed in the room the way his other voice landed, the one that ended things and decided things and remained after the moment that produced it. It landed for the servants in the doorway and for the other people who would have heard it from the corridor, because sound carried through these old stone halls in ways that rewarded the eavesdropper. She stopped. She turned. He was standing. He had not been standing before. He had been in the throne, and now he wasn't. Now he was on his feet at the edge of the dais, which was a different kind of presence than sitting. He was looking at her the way a man looks when he has made a decision that he has been approaching for the entire night and is only now arriving at. He said her name in the room, not her number, her name. The throne room, which she had come to clean at 2 in the morning with a cracked bucket and no expectations, went very, very quiet. She did not know, in that moment, what he was going to say next. She knew something was going to change. She had the particular stillness of someone standing at the edge of a thing they can see but not see past. She was still holding the bucket. The crack in the handle pressed against her palm at the angle that didn't hurt. She had held broken things for so long that she knew exactly how to hold them so they held together. She had been doing it so long she didn't think of it as a skill anymore. She thought of it as just what you did, what you knew, the angle that worked. The room was full of light now, the gray having resolved into something gold, the kind of light that old stone was built to receive, the kind that made the carved wolves on the throne look like they were breathing. She could see the crack in the rear pillar from here. She could see the clean lines of the columns, the clear windows, the floor running smooth and even to the doors. She could see the room she had cleaned in the dark, in the long hours of night, without knowing that anything would come of it. It was a good room. She had made it clean. The throne had a crack in it that everyone had been polishing over for years. She had not polished over it. She had pointed at it in the dark, with no audience and no reward, and said, "This should be fixed." The bucket handle pressed against her palm. She was 41. Her name was Sarah. She stood in the middle of the throne room and waited to find out what happened next, and something in her chest, something that was not quite hope, because she had burned that word out of her vocabulary a long time ago, but was perhaps the sensation that predicts hope, the feeling before the feeling, was being very, very loud. She had been sent to clean the throne. By sunrise, the throne had looked at her, and in this palace, where everything was decided by rank and blood, and the weight of old laws pressed down on the shoulders of the smallest people, in this palace, in this room, in the particular silence that followed a king saying an Omega's name, in a room full of witnesses, being looked at was the beginning of everything,